On today's show, we'll be covering an odd sleep paralysis experience, lost loved ones, a poltergeist, and one of the most chilling Ouija board experiences that I've ever heard. All coming up on this episode of Paranormal Mysteries. Thank you for joining me and welcome to another week of Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. I hope you've all had a great weekend, and before we start today's episode, I'd like to thank all of you for your support and generosity. And if you haven't already, please consider following, sharing, and reviewing the podcast. This always supports us by helping new listeners to find the show. You can also support us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. And if you'd like to share your paranormal encounter on the podcast, you can submit your story through email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through voice message at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. And of course, all these links can be found in the show notes. And with all that in mind, our first listener story comes to us from Will. And Will's story is called Civil War Spirit. Will says, "Hi, I hope you and your listeners are well and are having a good year so far. My story comes from at least 12 years ago when I was in my early teens. I have always been interested in the paranormal, almost obsessed. I have never had an encounter until this event. The land my grandmother lives on and my parents has been occupied for more than 100 years by my family, and what used to be the main road in our area runs through my parents' front yard, so there was plenty of traffic and different energies passing through there at any given time. I know the land at one time was occupied by Native Americans, as we have found countless arrowheads and tomahawks on our property. I'm almost positive there were soldiers during the Civil War that came through the area as well, but no battle was ever fought around the area. I was at my grandmother's house on a summer evening. This was the same grandmother that lives on the property. I was in her front yard, swinging from a rope that I had tied to a tree limb, and the sun was starting to go down behind the trees a little. I got tired of swinging and got ready to go back inside, and when I turned on my grandmother's front porch, I saw what I can only describe as a Confederate soldier. I couldn't see a head or legs, but I could clearly see his torso. I could tell he was in uniform. It was gray with 2 rows of buttons down the front and a sash of some kind across his chest. It wasn't a frightening experience at all. It felt like he was just making himself known. I feel honored, actually, that I was the one he chose to show himself to. I'm sorry if this story was long, but I just wanted to set the scene and get all of the details in. I hope you have a great day." Our next story of the night comes to us from Linda, and Linda's story is called The Rabbit Man. Linda says, "Hi Nick, I've been binging your podcasts while I'm at work, and I felt the need to write in about some of my own experiences. I apologize in advance for the long story, and I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible. Ever since I was little, I have experienced many different occurrences that I truly cannot find an explanation for. Some of them being very minor, while others being extremely shocking. Around 8 years ago, I was living at my parents' house, along with my sister and my 3-year-old nephew, who we will call Leo. I had experienced sleep paralysis one night. I had been lying on my side facing toward the door to my bedroom when I saw a lanky, white figure enter the room and start to walk along the wall. What was super noticeable about this figure was that it had animalistic ears, almost like rabbit ears. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, as I was so terrified of experiencing the same thing again. I spent the whole night researching sleep paralysis and chalked it up to what I saw as being my brain tricking itself, and it's important to note that I hadn't talked to anyone about this issue yet. A couple days later, my nephew woke up in the middle of the night. Him and I had bedrooms right next to one another, so I could always hear when he was up. I heard him calm down and eventually fall asleep. In the morning, my sister and I were talking, and she said, "Yeah, it's so strange. Leo told me that he saw someone in his room last night. He said he was white and had rabbit ears. He called him the Rabbit Man." I was so shocked, I couldn't even believe it. Fast forward a few years later, my sister and I had each moved out of my parents' house, and my nephew was around the age of 9 at this point. One night he came downstairs and told my sister, "He's back." My sister then asked, "Who is back?" And he said, "The Rabbit Man." It's been a couple of years since then, and he said nothing more about the Rabbit Man, at least that I know of, nor have I encountered him myself. I've always wondered who this man was, and why we were the only two that had ever seen him. Thanks in advance for reading my story. I enjoy your podcast tremendously, and I appreciate you giving people a great platform to talk about their experiences. Our next story of the night comes to us from Nikki, and Nikki says, "Hi Nick, I love your podcast. I listen almost every day now, as I'm a new fan. I love that this is a place for people to come and share their stories, and I thank you for providing that. I'll start by saying that I've always been open to the idea that spirits exist in our human world. As a young girl, I learned to ride my bike in the Jewish cemetery next door to my family's house. My grandfather also happened to be buried there. I don't recall having any experiences as a child living where I did, but I've always been curious about the paranormal and eager to hear other people's stories, even if they scared me. This is not a frightening story. This is more to me about love conquering distance. My dear grandmother Barbara passed away on Valentine's Day of 2010. She was 90 years old. I come from a large family, and we were all very close. Most of us were present at the time, and as weird as this may sound, I was lucky enough to be one of the people holding her hand as she died. It was peaceful, and everything that I could have asked for in that kind of situation. She and I were very close, and one of the best compliments I've ever received in my life was when someone told me that they saw so much of her in me. The day she passed, we had to drive back home from Massachusetts, as we lived a state over. I had been visiting my mother, but mainly living with my boyfriend about 20 minutes away at the time. My stepfather took pity on me and asked if I'd like a ride back to the apartment, so I could go see my boyfriend and gather my things for the next week, as we would have to return to Massachusetts for the arrangements, the funeral, and in the Jewish religion, sitting Shiva. I took him up on his offer. We lived in an apartment on the 4th floor, essentially an attic that had been turned into an apartment. I relaxed a bit and tried to collect myself. I gathered my things, and we got into bed. I couldn't sleep. My grandmother was weighing heavy on my mind. I just couldn't imagine a world without her in it. My boyfriend then started snoring. I was facing the wall next to me. Realizing how late it was, I decided that I really needed to at least attempt to sleep. I sat up so I could switch positions and face him, and as I did, this very small but luminous ball of light appeared about 8 feet from me. It was in front of my dresser, which was directly in front of my bed. I'm looking around for a source, but as I stated, I lived on the top floor, so no one could have been outside the window. I was a little freaked out at this point, and I was frozen in awe. I watched it move slowly from the right of the room to the left, and it dissipated before it hit the wall. And as soon as it did, I smelled my grandmother. I felt her presence. A peace washed over me that made my heart, which had been beating a mile a minute all day, calm down. I knew what I had just seen was what people refer to as orbs, and even more so, I knew my grandmother was trying to let me know that she was okay, and that wherever she isn't far. I wish everyone nothing but love, light, grace, and good vibes. Thank you for sharing my story. Sincerely, Nikki. Our next story comes to us from Brandy, and Brandy's story is called Poltergeist House. Brandy says, "Hi Nick, I've binged most of your shows, and listening to these stories always keeps my interest piqued. Thank you for creating a forum to share our experiences. My experience is just one among many that happened in this particular house. When I was younger, I moved to North Carolina to go to school, and this one particular house seemed to have an intense amount of activity that we couldn't explain. I always tried to find a rational explanation for things instead of jumping to conclusions. When I lived there originally, I was about 19 years old. Things would happen such as the TV turning on and off by itself, lamps turning on their own, mysterious shadows that would move about in still light, and utensils falling in the kitchen with no one present, etc. I used to think that maybe the TV could be explained because perhaps I wasn't turning it off completely until I noticed it would turn on by itself after I had left the room for a few minutes, or it would go on and off repeatedly after we turn it off and leave the room. Nothing was ever malevolent, and in my opinion it was almost amusing to see things unfold. We even nicknamed our little poltergeist Charlie. Fast forward a couple of years, I was living there with my sister and my then roommate. The entry had a porch that would extend the length of the front of the house with poured concrete. When you walk into the front door, there was a short hallway that opened to the living room, and if you turned to the left, all the bedrooms wrapped around the corner with my sister's bed facing the front of the house and the porch with a single window. One evening, me and my roommate were sitting in the living room talking. No TV or radio was on, and just a single lamp, and my sister was in her bedroom reading at the time. Suddenly, both me and my roommate heard footsteps on the front porch shuffling around, like heavy shoes walking around with sandy footsteps. We both froze, thinking there might be an intruder, because who would be on the porch this late at night and without ringing the doorbell? So I cautiously walked to the front door to peep out the peephole. The porch light was on at the time, and I heard the shuffling footsteps the entire time. Though this was a fairly quiet and calm neighborhood, I told my roommate to prepare to call the police just in case. I fully expected to see someone walking there, but there was no one. There was no time for them to disappear from sight either, as there were streetlights brightly illuminating our entire street, and they would have had to have jumped the railing to get over the porch that was fenced in around the entry steps. I would have questioned the entire experience, except for the fact that right at that moment, my sister walked into the living room and told us that there was a man outside her window. She said she saw a silhouette of a man standing there, and she thought that we might have had company. But why were they standing there? Me and my roommate hadn't said a word the entire time, so she couldn't have known that we had heard or saw anything unusual. She was genuinely frightened, and although we couldn't see anyone out the peephole, we all heard someone, and she was able to see the silhouette from her window not even 6 feet from the front door. The footsteps had stopped by then, and we all just stared at each other. And this still gives me the chills just thinking about it. I've had many more experiences since then, and I'd love to share them with you and your listeners, given the opportunity. Thank you again for hosting such an interesting podcast, and I look forward to hearing many more in the future. Brandy. Our next story of the night comes to us from Peggy, and Peggy's story is called Ouija Board Nightmare. Peggy's experience is one of the most detailed and unsettling experiences that I've had the honor of sharing, and I hope that Peggy's story is a reminder to everyone that even though they are marketed as such, Ouija boards are most definitely not toys. This is Peggy's story. Hi, Nick. Let me preface this by saying that I spent almost 70 years being told that what I experienced was in my head by some parts of my family, and the work of the devil's child by others. It's a bit of a relief to hear other stories, even though the circumstances are unfortunately similar. Here is a little history on me, because it will help you understand the era I come from. I was born in 1932 in a little town in Ohio that I don't think exists anymore. I went to school in a one-room class with children ranging in ages from 7 to 20, all being taught the same material. My father was a Virginia coal miner who died in 1956 from the black lung, and my adopted mother died in 2007 of natural causes. The dangers of World War II were something we were trained to deal with growing up, as there was always the possibility of a bomb being dropped on our heads at any given time. In 1952, I was just out of high school when we moved to a place that actually had separation of education by grade and age. I then joined the Navy, wanting to do my part to serve my country. It was different for women back then, though. I was a nurse tasked with caring for soldiers who came home with one injury or another. Most women didn't leave the States for the armed forces back then, so we did our duty here at home, however we were able. But I digress. When I was still a child around 11 or 12, some of the children in my neighborhood, and I use the term loosely, given that the houses were spaced almost a quarter-mile apart back then, obtained a Ouija board. When I'd spoken to my adopted mother about playing the game with them, she strictly forbade it, saying that it was the devil's game, and only the wicked would touch such a vile thing. If you couldn't tell, she was very religious, being a direct blood descendant of Brigham Young of the Mormon Church, his grandniece to be exact. I was told to go pray for forgiveness and to never play with those children again. But I was prepubescent, and like my children and grandchildren after me, I just had to see what it was that she was telling me not to do. My cousins and the children from the area went to one of the barns, I can't remember whose at the moment, where one of the boys pulled out the game. We all sat quietly looking over the carved wooden surface, as there wasn't cardboard at the time, and we were admiring its polished surface. The letters were all burned into the board like they did on old saloon signs, and it had been polished to a high shine. We all placed our hands on the planchette and began asking questions. At first, nothing happened. Then, as we were all about to give up, the token began to move. We accused each other of moving it, as that's what children did. It spelled out the name Ezekiel, and said that it was from the colonial days. We asked a few more questions before one of the children was called away by their parents. We then left the board where it was in the hayloft, and went to our respective homes. For the next several weeks, we met in secrecy to play the game, each time getting more direct and aggressive responses. Things finally came to a head after several months, when one of the boys became angry with the game and threw it across the loft. It had spelled out some very not nice things in response to what he'd been asking, and he decided that he was done with it altogether. But you can't really be done with a Ouija board. Not really. Things then started happening to our small secret group. One of the children was thrown from a horse that was dead broke. In other words, so tame you could put a newborn on it, and it shattered his arm. Sheep were being attacked by animals out of nowhere, where there hadn't been any cases previously, and one of the other girls had been hospitalized after being attacked by the old bull a few properties down from ours. The barn itself started to feel scary. We heard whispers in the shadows. Things moved when no one was touching them, and we even felt as though we were constantly being watched. One of the children had drawn suspicion to our activities and to the game from their parents, and asked me to hide it in my room for a few days. Back then, it wasn't uncommon to get several lashings with a leather belt for disobeying or disrespecting your elders, so we all tried to avoid it whenever we could. I tucked the polished wooden game under my bed and tried to pretend I was innocent of everything we were being accused of, but that only made things worse. My house soon became active with sounds of slamming doors, dishes being thrown across the room, and growls, deep, unearthly growls, from every shadow. I became terrified of sleeping in my own room, and so I resorted to sleeping outside my parents' bedroom and getting up before my father did at 5 a.m. One morning, though, my father had to get up early to go to work, and he tripped over me in the hall. After much coaxing and more than enough tears, I broke down and told him what had happened. My adopted mother then retrieved the game from under my bed and threw it outside in the trash. I took my lashings that I fully deserved for lying to them, and I thought that that was the end of it. If only that was. The activity never stopped. There was a dark presence in that house that was tied to that board. When it showed up in various rooms throughout the house, my adopted mother accused me of retrieving it from the trash so that I could continue to be Satan's daughter. I swore that it wasn't me, but she refused to believe me, until she'd sent me away with one of my cousins for bad behavior, that is. According to my father, the board appeared several times after I'd gone, in various rooms of the house. Once it even appeared in his bedroom after my adopted mother had thrown it away for what could have been the 100th time. He later told me that he'd heard a voice tell him that nothing could remove the evil that had been invited in, and his family would suffer because of it. My father even sought answers from local church authorities, but none of them really had any. Realizing the activity didn't stop because I was gone, I was brought home and made to sleep in my room. I hated it, and used any excuse I could to sleep anywhere but there. The living room, my father's room at the foot of his bed, anywhere that wasn't my room. My father decided to move closer to work, and he put the house up for sale. As we were settling into our new home, my adopted mother began unpacking our things. I was folding clothes when I heard her yell my name. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze in my tracks. In her hands was the Ouija board. I had watched, and so had she, as my father placed it in the trash heap before we left our old house. When my father saw the board, he grabbed it from our hands and stormed outside. We followed him, looking at him to be the only protection we had, and we watched as he tossed the board onto the ground in the yard. He had taken a lantern from inside the house and broke it on the board with such force that the oil and glass went everywhere. I gripped my adopted mother's hand as he lit a match and tossed it on the board, fearful that the dark entity would douse the flame before it took hold. Black smoke filled the sky as the wood burned, and I swear, Nick, I heard that old board scream in pain and rage as the fire consumed it. My father shouted for whatever demons that had possessed that board to go back to hell where they belonged, and he made sure that there wasn't even ash left once the fire finally died out. He had the house exorcised after that, and things became blessedly normal. We never spoke of the board again, and such talk was forbidden in our house. When one of my daughters mentioned being invited to play with a few other of her friends as a child of the same age I was, I immediately related my tale to her and advised against it. Thankfully, she listened and stayed away from the cursed game. Why anyone thought that it would be a good idea to market and sell such a device is beyond me, but I would express caution to your listeners. Dark things dwell in the shadows beyond our vision, and inviting them in only brings disaster and grief. Until your podcast was shared with me by my youngest daughter, I thought I'd been cursed to have experienced such a nightmare. It wasn't the sort of thing spoken about in polite conversation with decent people. It's a relief to know that I'm not the only one who had such a harrowing experience, and I wish that others could be spared. I apologize for the length, as I know I can be quite wordy at times. Fortunately for me, age has not robbed me of my faculties, allowing me to relate to you a cautionary tale from my youth. Thank you for all you do, and may blessings guide your spirit. Peggy. Peggy, thank you for your story and your service. As we bring tonight's episode to an end, I appreciate all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to Will, Linda, Nikki, Brandy, and Peggy for sharing their experiences. And if you've witnessed something paranormal, I'd like to hear your story. You can contact me through email, voice message, or of course on our website, and all these links can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and I look forward to seeing you back here on Wednesday as we continue our journey into the unexplained, right here on Paranormal Mysteries.